Welcome to another interesting episode of Open Book on Location. I'm Katie Poole, the board chair of the Literary Alliance and a passionate reader like you. Now in our 12th year, our all-volunteer nonprofit provides these fabulous conversations with your favorite authors. At our website, pasadenaliteraryalliance.org, you can find more author interviews, make donations to the Alliance to allow us to provide grants for literary initiatives, and participate. Send questions for the authors or contribute author suggestions at the Contact Us tab. See you soon at Open Book on Location.
Well, I'm delighted to be speaking today with my longtime, we don't say old, longtime friend, Naomi Hirahara. Naomi and I met, back in like 2005, I think, something like that, when we were both on the board of the Southern California chapter of MWA. Both of us at that time were getting deeply involved in the mystery world. So let's go back a little bit before that. So you were, as I recall, part of one of your jobs was a journalist. Was that your first job as a journalist?
Actually, yeah, my first job out of college, I was first writing for these fly-by-night magazines, you know, the type where my checks would bounce and subsequently all my other checks would bounce. And then they would eventually pay me in cash. It was very suspect. But then I eventually started working at a Japanese American newspaper. It's like the biggest in the country in Little Tokyo, Los Angeles. I was a reporter and I became an editor there. And it was just it was a wonderful experience because it was a small staff. We had to do everything. We didn't have, you know, I had the crime beat. I had to write about ballroom dancing, you know, restaurant reviews, you know, the whole gamut. And then we saw the whole process of the paper being printed, you know. So it was a great initiation for me just to understand how publishing works, how to deal with the public. We would have angry readers, you know, I would have to talk to, you know, face to face. It wouldn't be just like emails or that kind of thing. And we would get very suspect packages that today we would never open. But of course, we were very eager to see what was in these weird things that people would send us. So yeah, that was my.
Well, many writers have started as journalists and then made the transition. And I mean, two things that I've noticed. I mean, one is obviously you have been trained to pay a lot of attention to the facts, and that the facts are everything. The background is critical. But more importantly, you never hear journalists say, "Oh, I have writer's block." You know, "I'm sorry, boss, I can't get that article in on time. I've got writer's block." You know, journalists understand, like lawyers, by the way. Lawyers are the same way. We can't say to our clients, "I have writer's block. I can't finish the work that I'm doing for you."
And then even the environment that you write in, because I was like one of the few women in the newsroom, and there was no cubicles. Like I could directly see the sports writer right across from me. They would be talking sports. They allowed smoking back then, you know, so I had a filter to try to, you know, it didn't really work. So under those kind of circumstances, it's like, you know, right, and people are talking. So it was wonderful training for me because, you know, these days when people ask you like, what word processing program do you work, or do you listen with music? It's like, no, I don't. I prefer, you know, a quiet place without music, but I find I could write under, you know, even the most adverse circumstances. Not that I would want to, but I
Right.
can.
Right. Did you always have it in your head that you wanted to write books?
Yes. And it all started at the Altadena library where I went as a child, and I would get you know, if you see me in person, you'd know I'm vertically challenged. So I'd get stacks of books that were bigger than me, like during summer reading programs. And, you know, so I escaped and traveled through books. That was, you know, that was my love. And that's how I love story. Rather than, our family's not that verbal. So my narrative came from the written word.
So what was your first book? What, was it before you were published, or was there a book before you were published, or not?
The first book I had published was a nonfiction book. It was a biography for the Japanese American National Museum. It was on a gentleman named George Aratani, who was the founder. He was a businessman, entrepreneur.
Right.
Founded Kenwood Electronics as well as Mikasa Chinaware. So that was actually my first book. That I had been working on my first book, my first novel before then, but the George Aratani biography came out first.
And so the first Mas Arai book was that was your first fiction?
Yes, it was. Summer of the Big Bachi. Yeah.
And an overnight success. The book was very well received.
It was, you know, this, for people who haven't read my book, this is about an older Japanese American gardener and Hiroshima survivor who, he also lives in Altadena and he solves crimes. So really sexy, right? So I think now I'm more open to reading about older characters. But I think back then people didn't really want to, you know, read about an elderly person. So it was a harder sell, but I was shocked that people liked him. You know, he was a curmudgeon, but there was something about him that made people from all over I thought it might be just like Japanese Americans or just people from California.
Oh no, he was so wonderful. He was clearly a real person, but he wasn't somebody you knew. He was you made him up. He was a composite, I'm sure, like most.
He was inspired by my father, but I was very close to my father, whereas Mas is estranged from his daughter. But yeah, it wasn't just my father. Personality-wise,
of course, everybody is a composite.
No other cranky old man. And then even I say my alter ego is a cranky old man. You know, that's who I am inside.
So the series was eventually 5 books.
It was 7.
7. Is that right? 7. Of course, I appeared as a character in one of them, as I recall. I was an evil doll maker or something, doll store owner.
Yeah, Blood Hina, yes.
Yes, 7 books. Well, and so I want to talk a little bit about the genre of the kind of books that you were writing. They're not strictly what people would call cozies in the Agatha Christie sense, but they are an amateur detective who sort of has things happen and he just coincidentally happens to sort of be around them. I've never been around a single murder, but Mas was around a bunch of them. And S.T. Joshi just came out with a book in which he was attempting to survey the mystery field. And he said some pretty unkind things, I thought, about cozies and maybe mysteries generally, that they can't ever be great art. That sort of by definition, they're not going to be of literary quality. I don't believe that, and I don't think you believe it. But do you want to respond to that?
Well, I think the thing I love about the mystery genre is there's movement to it. And I think so much we subscribe, like literary, writing has to be sitting still and super descriptive and so interior. And to me, what really makes people interesting is what makes them get out of their chair, what forces them. And I don't think that's necessarily an extraordinary thing. We all decide to get out of our chair at some point or the other. And that's why I love the mystery container. I like to write about ordinary people, and what makes them interesting to the reader is our genre. And because it is more high stakes, it is amplified for sure, but I think everything in literature is probably amplified. We don't want to watch something that's totally,
Boring.
realistic, right?
Right.
It has needs, yes, and it needs some kind of arc. I think plot is very maligned, and I think there's a craft to plot. There's a beauty in plot. It doesn't have to be formulaic, but there's something to it. I think, the gentleman, the critic you mentioned, he perhaps does not fully respect it. But if you really look at readers want that movement. They want the plot. There's something inside of us that seeks that kind of narrative. And I think it's condescending to say to readers, like, no, what you're longing for is, subpar
Right.
literature.
Breakfast cereal. It's
Yeah, right.
well, I fully agree with you, and I think in addition, the great writers of mysteries, and I put you in that league. Um, their characters are so far from cardboard. I mean, yeah, fine. Mas solves 7 crimes over 7 books, but he himself is a fascinating person, and an interesting person. To see him struggle with his heritage, to see him struggle with the memories of Hiroshima, and the problems of the Japanese community. One of the books is about the issues of the Japanese farmers. Who sort of everybody seems to have forgotten about, especially those that were interned after or during the war and so on. And so your books are much more than just mysteries. I'm not saying that to justify them, but I think that that's what makes them so good, is that they are about real people, recognizable people struggling with real problems.
Well, I think sometimes people desire something that's very fatalistic. And of course, within our genre, we do have noir. Because I write serious fiction, there is some hopefulness to it, because Moss, I have him in 7 books, so he's alive in 7 books. But what's wrong with that? What's wrong? Because I've witnessed people, go through tremendously hard things, yet they keep going on. Not everybody just sinks completely, and that's what I love about, mystery series fiction, because there is something to be said about the perseverance of character. And I don't think it's not juvenile. It's, there are people who do persevere and they're able to survive and thrive, no matter what terrible things that have happened to them in the past. And that's why I kind of love the mystery series. And I think a lot of people gravitate towards it for that very
So
reason.
did you always know you wanted to write mysteries, or was it just you didn't know what kind of book it was going to be? And
It started as literary fiction.
I see.
It was a
Okay,
genre, and
you really wanted to make no money.
yeah. And it just, I had 2 characters, and one of my writing mentors just told me, I had a doctor from Hiroshima who was a younger person. And my writing mentor was saying, Naomi, your Moss character is just far more interesting. You should just kind of stick. And that's the problem if you have I want to someday learn how to write multiple characters in one book. But inevitably what happens is you fall in love with one of those characters and you just want to read the part when they're in it, So I'm still working on that craft. But so I eliminated the secondary character and just went all in with Moss.
So tell us about the new series. This is a more of a police procedural now, I guess, in a broad sense. That is to say, your central figure is a cop. Uh,
Yeah, so Les, I have actually 2 other kind of
two series.
series,
Yes, I know.
and they're both like 20-something women,
Yes.
and one, Officer Ellie Rush, she's a mixed race LAPD bicycle cop, and it's just a fun romp. It's just talking about downtown Los Angeles, which I love, and all its environs. So and what's funny is I met a woman whose father was 90. He was Japanese American in his 90s, And she says, he just is loving your book. I thought it was the Mas Arai series. He fell in love with Ellie Rush because he wanted to picture himself as this bicycle cop just going down the streets of
Great.
downtown LA.
Great. So tell us about the new book, the
I'm,
one that's almost done.
I'm currently working on a standalone called Clark and Division, and it's my first historical. I usually write about contemporary people, but the past comes in. But this takes place in Chicago in 1944.
Why? Why'd you pick that?
It's kind of in keeping. I do write a lot about the Japanese American experience. So Chicago was the top destination for people who were incarcerated in the 10 camps.
Really?
That's where most of them went.
I grew up in Chicago. I didn't know that.
Well, this was 1944, and then most of them returned to the West Coast. But it went from 400 Japanese Americans to 20,000.
Wow.
And do you know Clark and Division? That's an
Sure.
actual intersection. So
Sure.
that was one of the places where they had a lot of boarding homes and things. And all have it because it was Chicago, and it was mostly young people in their 20s who came without their parents. Kind of all havoc broke loose. So when I wrote about that for a nonfiction book, but I also put on my mystery hat, and I was going, this is fascinating. I have to write about this. So.
Well, historical
So,
fiction
yeah.
is hard. Now, you'd already done the research for a nonfiction book. It sounds like set in that time and place, so you were ready. But so, what do you think? Is it harder? Is it just different?
I think what's hard, the difficult part, like for any project, is to get the right voice for the character. And it took me a while. This is a 20-something woman. So it's kind of interesting. It's kind of like I combined like the Ellie Rush and Mas Arai together. And it's set in the 40s.
So she has been in a camp, and now
Yes.
she's out.
Yeah, she was in Manzanar in California. Yeah. But there's a lot of, they call it Nisei, the second generation.
Right.
They're not very forthcoming, like in oral histories. There's a lot of gaps. And so that's what I use fiction to fill in the gaps and to kind of write about the reality of how difficult it was. Like people when they've done oral histories as an older person, they don't really recall the hardships. But through fiction, I'm able to go there, and just imagine how did it feel? You're going from a camp when you're with 10,000 Japanese Americans to a place like Chicago. You've never been there before, with $25 in your pocket and a rundown, apartment. Just imagine how did that feel to be in that situation?
And a completely different world. I mean, Chicago has a very large Black population, and California didn't back then, and still doesn't have a big one. But so that in itself would have been a huge switch for her.
And all the crime. There's so much crime and craziness there.
Yes,
it's wide open.
And corruption.
Yes.
I mean, we have to say that it's still, unfortunately, I think the most corrupt city in the world. But interesting. I grew up there in the late 40s, and I just remember, you'd seen the newspaper in the article, "Oh ho hum, another body found in a trunk." That was just sort of the norm. So it's an interesting time. Well, I can't wait to read the book. It's almost done, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So let me ask, how do you see, so now you're I started to use the word old again now, seasoned pro. Yeah. It's almost 20 years since your first book, and it's 15. It's 15 plus. Yeah. How has the publishing world changed? How's it changed for you? And what do you see as different or better or worse?
It's completely changed, for so many different reasons. But I think ebooks, like in the 2010, 2011, that really changed things quite tremendously for publishing. I think the whole mid-list, and we've all discussed this, in different venues. I'm a mid-list author. That's completely fine with me. But I think the mid list has been really pressed, and so I think it's one thing to get your book published. It's another thing to sustain yourself and to have multiple books published. I think that's
Yes.
the larger challenge. And because of all the technological changes, and then also with journalism, there's less outlets to be reviewed. Now it's more, internet based. So it requires us, and then social media is such an important part of this whole,
Oh yes, and you've been very good at it. You've been very good at it. You've been a regular poster to various outlets and all that. So, well, I want to come back to this subject when you and Gary and I talk, because I want to talk about diversity and how the publishing universe, I think, has changed for the better in that regard. But let's talk about that. So let's take a break, and we'll come back with our friend Gary Phillips, and then the three of us will talk some more. My old friend Gary Phillips, how are you?
I'm fine, Les. How are you?
I'm great. I'm great. You said to me earlier that you're really busy writing.
Well, it comes and goes, right? Like it's the world or the fate of the freelance writer. So there are a lot of times when it's just a drought, and a few times when the spigot is flowing. So this is one of the few times when the spigot is flowing.
Well, you have been, from my point of view, very successful in getting into various media. And I want to get to that in a minute, but I want to go back to the beginning with you, Gary. So you started as a community organizer.
That's right.
Which is about as far away from the solitary life of a writer as you can get.
True.
So what happened? Where did you go wrong?
Well, I think like a lot of us, Les, I grew up, I grew up playing sports in school, but I was also something of a mystery fan. And I guess pertinent to our discussion today, I also should mention, as Naomi mentioned about having that experience as a young child at the library. My mom was a librarian, so I grew up around books. I don't think she was too pleased that I grew up also reading comic books. That's probably not what she had in mind.
She was wrong, obviously, but
But nonetheless, I certainly grew up, appreciating books, and then I think partly because of just stuff I watched on TV as a kid, reruns of Twilight Zone and what have you. Maddox, I recall from junior high. I don't know, man. I just sort of gravitated to mysteries, and I think because just the whole idea that you could tell these different stories in the genre, mysteries and crime fiction, it just seemed like a natural. Then eventually, when I sort of took some of the experiences I had as a community organizer and labor organizer and what have you, running a nonprofit, that I would then, take some of that and put it into my books.
So what was the big factor? I mean, what made you say, maybe I'll write a book?
Well, I think it was always in my mind. And I think in my 20s, I was sort of consumed with what I was doing. And then I guess, and I can specifically know that when my buddy Gar Haywood published his first novel, which I guess was Fear of the Dark, and I want to say that was 89. I think that is, in fact, I'm pretty sure it was 89. Because I remember, because he and I met because we were comic book fans. And in those days, you did what they called fanzines, which were amateur comic books.
Right.
And that's how he and I met over a fanzine that he and a couple of buddies from high school had started called The Enforcers, which is the name of their superhero group. And so we kind of knew each other from that. As it turned out, by the way, we also have folks who came from the same hometown in Texas, but we didn't know that then. Anyway, when Gar had won I think St. Martin still does it, right? It's the
right.
best first private eye novel unpublished, right? Unpublished and unagented, where you could send over the transom. And Gar had won that, and that book came out in 89. And I thought then, well, and I thought it was a pretty good book, and I thought that it helped to kind of light the fire under me to say, well, I should really get it in gear. Here I am.
If Gar could do it, I could do it. Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. But just the idea that I shouldn't wait around. I should really get going on it. And my wife at the time, my wife is still my wife now. I'm not suggesting I have a different wife. But my wife then said, well, you should do it because you have a little bit of time now. Although I was working at a nonprofit, but I was young, and so I could come in at night and I could write at night, which I can't do anymore. But that helped to get me in gear. And that first book, the first attempt never got published, but the second book, which features the same characters, Ivan Monkey, particularly my Private Eye character, became Violent Spring, which was set in the aftermath of '92, which again, drawing on my experiences, I felt that I could put that in the context of a mystery novel.
So you always knew you wanted to write mysteries, or?
Yes. Yeah, I always knew. Well, I knew two things. I always knew I wanted to write mysteries because I kept reading them and consuming them. So I figured that's the thing I want to do, and because I had also been influenced by the Twilight Zone. So I've dabbled a bit in sort of those kind of stories, but never a full blown novel. But a few short stories I've done have been sort of in that vein as well.
And then somewhere along the way, just to stick it to your mother, you went really wrong and started writing for comics.
Well, yeah, there is that. But, well, what can I do? I mean, when I grew up, our comics of choice were all the Marvel comics. So that's Jack Kirby,
of course,
Kane, right? Steve Ditko, all that stuff. Steranko when he was doing Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. So all that stuff was in my head. It had to come out in some fashion because it was just going to, it would just eat me alive if I didn't try to do it.
And then you've also written some television.
In my golden years now, I've had in the past a few of my novels, short stories, even a couple of graphic novels optioned for film and or TV. But now, as it happens, sad to say, the late John Singleton, who came on the scene with Boys in the Hood,
yes,
John had made some forays into television in the last few years, one of them being a show called Snowfall. And Snowfall is set in the 1980s South Central, where I grew up. And it's about sort of cracking the CIA. So it seemed like a kind of natural fit that that I would wind up being as a staff writer on that show.
So obviously they're very different. Each of those three media is extremely different. And what are your feelings about them? You like one, or it's nice to change? It's nice to go back and forth?
It really keeps me sharp, I think, as a writer to do a screenplay, which is one form of writing and very truncated, very visual, very much really part down to the bare bones in terms of, but you still got to talk about character. You still have to advance the plot, as Naomi talked about. You still have to have that movement. Versus prose, where, let's face it, we have all the pages in the world you need to tell your story, but you still got to be able to tell it in some kind of efficient, clear way. And then comics, and comics being a kind of weird
midway
between the.
Yeah, exactly. Sort of similar to television in that it's absolutely time limited. You've got to be very economical, and yet you have freedom. The special effects budget is unlimited.
That's right. We can have galaxies, we can have Galactus, we can have whatever we want. That's absolutely right. And but in the end, it's an artist's medium, right? It's the artists who carry the weight. There's a reason they get 2 to 3 times a page rate than what the writer gets, because that's why you buy the comic. You buy the comic. Sometimes I guess you buy now maybe for the writer or maybe for the artist-writer team, but really you're buying it for the art. That's what has that. They're the storyteller as well, and they have to tell that story.
Yeah, but I mean, you are the embodiment of Scott McCloud's argument that comics are a medium. They're not a genre. They're a medium.
Right. That's right. Exactly. Well, that's right. That's exactly right. And in that medium, you can tell these different stories, whether it's superhero stories, whether it's about a woman returning to help her, I think it's called Final Exits, where a woman returns to help her aging parents essentially kind of make their final exit, right? It's a very human, very low scale kind of story, low stakes kind of story. Or you can tell a crime story, or you can tell a police procedural. You can tell a fantasy story. There's all kinds of stories you can tell within the comics medium.
I'm the chair of the graphic novel jury for the Horror Writers Association, and oh my goodness, the quality of the work that we are seeing, especially from the independent publishers like Boom and Image, and just amazing stuff. I mean, really, literature, real
Right.
literature.
No, it is. No, it truly is. And you're right. And like in a film or TV project, it is the marriage of both the visual and the prose and the words that, if they're working together, it just carries you along.
So, like Naomi, you've been around the publishing author business for a while. How has it changed for you?
You know, it's an interesting question. I was thinking about that when you asked Naomi that. You know, on one hand, we know that things are a lot easier in terms of getting work out there, in terms of self-publishing, or I guess now hybrid publishers, right? Which is I guess have made the scene. Still in all, your job is, you know, to tell a compelling story that hopefully keeps the reader turning the page. So that's still number one. You still want to be able to both entertain and entice and maybe infuriate of the reader, but you want them coming back for more. So that is to say, you know, the mark against, of course, self-publishing is if it doesn't go through the rigors of editing and what have you, then the product is not necessarily as good as it could be. It is certainly the case, though. Now there's a lot of freelance editors around. There's a lot of people who do both, right? They traditionally publish, and they also self-publish. But the self-publishing, they also put it through the rigors of the process, right? Of editing, content editing for line edits, etc. I'm actually curious about this new thing. Was it Quibi? Which
Yes.
These 10-minute
Right.
intervals. I don't know. Maybe that's something for the internet age, I guess, because we all have ADD now. But I'm not sure about that. But again, it's interesting to think about it as an experiment in terms of a way to tell the story.
Yeah, and that you might be able to do 10-minute short stories and the like.
Some things, yeah. I don't think all things, right? Because some things you want to build and have that dramatic effect, etc.
Right.
Yeah.
The problem that I mean, one of the things that I've heard from many of our friends about the publishing world is that the big publishers seem to be more and more focused on, are you going to be the next Michael Connolly, the next Lee Child? And that's all they really care about.
Yeah.
That they're less and less willing to nurture writers, to take on mid-list writers and build their careers and all that. It's not economical anymore.
Yeah. Well, there is that. You're right. There certainly is that. And it certainly is the case that, as we know, there used to be this ratio between what your advance was and what they would spend then for promoting the book. That seems to have gone to the wayside. But it is also the case that there are any number of small presses, medium-sized presses, that will take a chance. As an example, years ago, when I was at the BotchaCon, I was in Vegas. What was the casino that blew up when we left? The Sands? Anyway, I think it was at the Sands, actually.
Yeah.
Which was already slated for demolition. But long story short, I got to talking with Johnny Temple, who's the publisher of Akashic Books.
Right.
And honestly, I was just talking to him. I wasn't trying to pitch him anything. And he's the one that then later sent me an email, asked me about this idea of mine that was me and Jerry Turvalon, which became the Cocaine Chronicles. And it became, for a small press, it became pretty much a nice little hit. It got on the bestsellers at one point. We got pretty nice royalty checks from it. We've got some foreign sales from it. But that's an example of something that a big publisher probably wouldn't have taken a chance on. But Johnny did. So it certainly is a case that, yes, I mean, the pressure is on to deliver the next big blockbuster, the next big marquee name.
Right.
But even given that, there's a whole lot of other sort of, as Naomi said, listen, I'm a mid-list writer. There's a whole lot of other stuff happening that if you keep at it, your work can get out there.
Tell me about the new book, Faking of the President. Is that the new one, or that's the previous one?
The Faking the President is the new one in the sense of I have a short story in it. It's for Three Rooms Press, who I previously had edited the Obama Inheritance,
right,
which won Anthony, I guess, a couple years ago, and now so now they followed up with the Faking of the President, which I didn't edit. Peter Garofoli's the publisher of Three Rooms edited the book, but assembled us together. And so now in this age that we're in, we've been doing a couple of virtual tours. In fact, we did one on Tuesday night for the book But yeah, but we got a nice review in PW.
Yes.
Who knows if that helps us sell units? I don't know. And now, as you know, bookstores open up again. Hopefully, that means people can go out and buy a copy or two.
So the Obama book was the wonderful, and people wanted more stories about Joe Biden and Barack Obama, the secret agents, the detective secret agents.
That's it. Oh, as well as Michelle Obama having a cadre of women enforcers who operated in the shadows. Yes.
Right.
Well, and we have lizard people. We have the Illuminati. Because what I told the writers was that take any insane, crazy conspiracy idea about Obama and run with it.
So tell us about the faking of the president in 1 minute or less.
1 minute or less. The faking of the president, I guess, is kind of in that same vein in this case, though we opened it up, or Peter opened it up to the various presidents out there. And I chose as my protagonist or anti-hero, I chose Bill Clinton. And in particular, I'm using him during the, if people remember, the Y2K brouhaha, where people were feared that computers were going to, blow up, and airplanes were going to fall out of the sky, and we would go backwards in time to the Mayan calendar, or whatever it is we were supposed to do. And so it's called Y2F and K, and this is true. Clinton actually did come to LA in '99 as part of the sort of economic tour. So I use that as an excuse so that when he comes to LA, he has to, of course, go see his African-American love child, who is a teenager, who just happens to be who also just happens to be a computer genius. And the kid has stumbled on a plot by the Russians to hack elections.
Sounds right to me. So. Well, I want to welcome Naomi back to the conversation because I want to get into a more serious topic about the world of publishing, greater diversity in the publishing community. Well, in the authors, we're seeing greater diversity getting out there and getting recognized and getting what it should be, which is sort of the equivalent of other writers. There shouldn't be a ghetto. It shouldn't be different. You guys have been leaders in that march towards what I hope is a better day today, and love to have your comments on that subject.
Gary, since you're the elder, I think you should respond first.
In the heart, Gary.
Yes,
in the heart.
Chronology.
I know.
You have a chronology.
No, I might more easily forget what I'm going to say. That's true. That's very true.
That's true.
Well, I think here's my thinking on that, because because this has certainly been a topic of conversation over some time. It's also the case that there have been writers of color, Black writers, other writers, who have in fact written books that weren't necessarily part of the mainstream, but the books existed and had an audience, as an example. Right. It is only the case, though, or I guess the part of the discussion is, and certainly if you looked at, I guess it might be the third wave, when, as I mentioned, when Gar came along in '89 with Fear of the Dark, that kind of signaled, and then Walter Mosley shows up. I think it's the following year, right? 1990, where Devil in a Blue Dress is published. Although that's a retro novel, it's a historical novel, right? Fear of the Dark being contemporary at the time. But nonetheless, these two sort of show up on the scene, and it kind of starts to then portend these sort of those gates opening up in the sense of this next wave of sort of Black crime and mystery writers showing up. My book, Violent Spring, I think was published in '94, and then on and on. But it is also the case, when I was a kid, there used to be a infamous publishing house called Holloway House. It was a publisher. Yeah, it was a publisher here in LA. They were white owned, but they published Black writers. They published the quote unquote Black experience. And in particular, they published two writers who have gone on to be some of note, who are no longer with us, but who are in fact of note. One was Iceberg Slim, AKA Robert Beck, who in fact had made his living as a pimp and a hustler, among other things. And he wrote about that. And he was actually a pretty good writer. He was actually a pretty decent writer. And actually one of those books was optioned, Airtight Willie and Me was optioned as a blaxploitation film in that time period. And then there was also Donald Goines. And Donald Goines was actually influenced by Beck. like Chester Himes, Donald Goines was in prison and was reading Robert Beck. And then he thought, well, hell, if Beck could write this stuff about this stuff, I can write about this stuff. And so he then wrote his kind of more out there, more pulpish kinds of novels. I say that to say those guys weren't, in those days, they weren't sold in the B. Daltons and the Pickwicks, which were the book chains in my youth. You found those books on the spinner rack, at the thrifty drugstore, at the bus station, and occasionally at one of the newsstands. But those are the books I read, right? Among other things that I would find at the B. Dalton or the Pickwicks. Which is, so I say that to say that this kind of underground and this kind of sort of other parallel universe of these writers existed. And it was only then, I guess, as we get to the 80s, that you start to see these worlds sort of merge, right? Or start to overlap. So
well, where does Chester Himes fit into that? Were you reading Himes' stuff when you were a kid?
Oh, sure. I was reading Himes. I was reading Hammett and Chandler as well, of course, and Ross McDonald. And Himes was kind of interesting because you're right, Himes has to go to Europe to write.
To get exactly. To get his recognition, he goes to France,
right, so. and to see his books reprint. And by the way, write a Harlem that he hardly ever really had set foot in. And his Harlem was a Harlem, there's an absurdist, it's a Harlem of the mind, it's not a Harlem of reality, okay. Right? But then we turn around and those books then get back to America. Cotton Comes to Harlem gets made, I think it's 1970, and then the next book, one of the other books gets made. And Himes sort of gets on the map. And he kind of, and interesting, right? And sort of apropos the discussion you and Naomi were having earlier, Himes started out to write, the great American novel, The Lonely Crusade, which is a great book, right? Very much a literary kind of book about, isolation and dissolution in his main character, and it's set in 40s LA. And then Walking Eggshells and some of those other books, but never quite got the recognition that he really should have. And it's only because then he was then convinced to write these sort of crazy, hyperbolic novels about these two Harlem detectives that he then gained an audience.
For me personally, Himes has been a huge influence. And, I've read his more literary books as well as the Harlem books. I'm fascinated with Himes, just his whole history and just his life in Los Angeles too, that we don't know too much about. He actually lived in the Japanese American family's house during World War II. The family was away and he lived.
Interesting.
Anyway, that's an aside. But like Gary, actually in my particular community, there are people writing this like noir in the newspaper I used to work for in the 1930s and 1920s. The only thing is, it was in the Japanese language. So people
it had a limited audience.
Yeah. Right. It was limited and people didn't know. But there's a small press called Kaya Press, which is out of USC, and they're starting to translate some of the stories. And
there's some great stuff. I've been editing this series for the Library of Congress. We're calling it the Library of Congress Crime Classics. And while we're not focused on trying to bring in writers of color, they're coming up. And of course, largely those are books, and we're focused on books that have sort of slipped out of the limelight. So we've looked at books like The Conjure Man Dies. Do you know that novel, Gary? Yeah. Wonderful novel, and great mystery story.
Rudolph Fisher.
Yes. Or The Black Detective, which is a fragment really, but it's an interesting novel. And the same is true on the horror genre, that there are some writers that were around that have sort of gotten overlooked. And we're seeing a resurgence there. But when we look today at who are the hot young faces in the mystery community, and it's terrific to see people like Alex Segura and Steph Shaw and Rachel Housel Hall, and a diversity, a wide spectrum of writers, not a bunch of old Jewish men like our good friend Lee Goldberg, who is going to be the next of these interviews, by the way.
I think
Go
there's
ahead.
a number of reasons why that is. I think one thing are the gatekeepers to some extent
Yes.
are kind of diversifying. The readership is, I mean, there's always been a readership, but I think in terms of, well, for instance, like if you look at people who went to, I'm not saying college educated people read more books than people who are not college educated, but if you just look at who was going to college in the 50s and 60s and who go to a college campus today, you know, it's going to be very different demographics.
Sure.
So, you know, the people who are in college today, they're going to be, many of them are going to be buying books and reading them, you know, when they finally get a job or whatever and can afford it. So I think just there's this natural, the demographics of readers of like big five books, they've changed, and they want to see things that reflect their experience. They want to see things that are different than they've seen before. And so I think that's going to naturally going to push, you know, what sort of things are going to be published. So I think that could be one of the factors. I think also, I think, what do you think, Gary? Do you think television and movie industry has impacted? I mean, we see like the success of so many African American, you know, TV and movie makers, you know, and that creates a demand for a certain narrative. I mean, that might have, you know, and then things like Crazy Rich Asians, whatever. I think that might, you know, encourage
Right.
And
editors.
it's other genre. I'm you know, I'm a real geek, and I think about, for example, the Watchmen series, in which the original is not about race relations, but the new one is.
No.
And our hero
Right.
is a black police officer, you know, and a woman, a black police woman. And we have coming up this summer, I'm really excited about Lovecraft Country coming this summer, from the novel by Matt Ruff, which is horror. Lovecraft meets what daily life is like for black people in the Midwest.
Right, and but also not without his criticism of Lovecraft himself, who was a pretty racist cat.
Yes, indeed.
But back up for a second to what Naomi said. I agree. I think within the worlds of pop culture, right, film and TV and comics and radio and what have you, all of this has an impact. All of it has an effect, and it certainly then, once the narrative starts to expand, because those narratives have always been there. It's just a question of who gets to experience them, right? But once those narratives then get better exposure or wider exposure than they've heretofore had, that can't help but change the game, if only because it says, oh, well, there's an audience there, or now certainly because of streaming and cable and all the things that we have, the audience is probably even more divided, right? It's even much more of a niche audience than it was in the past, which suggests then, at least as long as it lasts, you want to fill those niches with different kinds of material, different kinds of programming, because understanding that the margin for what would be considered a hit is so different now, right? You know, shows that get maybe 5 or 7 million viewers are considered pretty good, whereas in the past, you know, in the old days of network TV, that would have been axed. That's gone.
That said, I mean, I think it's still hard for, you know, writers of color. I know many who strive to break through. So I wouldn't, you know, some people can interpret this and go, oh, if you're a writer of color, you have a
you got it made.
Right.
So that's
Well, I mean, but that's part of the problem of what's happened in the industry. And Gary said it before. It used to be, you know, you got in advance and you got a commitment to some promotion. Now what you get from a smaller press is they promise you they're going to publish the book, probably. They may not give you any advance, and they're not going to spend a nickel on promote it. Or they're going to spend very little. And by the way, the same is true of the big publishers.
Well, no, but yes, I mean, that is true, but it's also the case, I mean, as I was saying about, for instance, about Akashi, small press, but because of the small press, every book they publish matters. And so they, you know what I mean? And they, whatever they committed to for Cocaine Chronicles, and I've done other stuff with them, whatever they committed to, they did. They followed through.
I understand.
You
But
know.
the days of ads in newspapers, tours,
Oh, yeah.
etc., those are over. I mean, the last book I published with a big publisher, I said the word tour, and they said, "Oh, great! Let us know where you're going to be."
That's right. That's right. That's right. Send a postcard, kid. Let us know. That's right.
Yeah.
Where's it coming?
It's a different world out there. So, and this is, I don't know if you remember our old pal, it was a young writer who was Phil Hawley, who wrote a book. He was a chapter member back in the early 2000s. He was a doctor, and he wrote a terrific thriller paperback. It was great. It got nice critical reviews and all that. And then the publisher said to him, "We want to do a second book." And he said, "No, thanks." He said, "I hated the marketing. I loved writing the book. I didn't want to be the one who had to go out and sell it. This isn't for me." And I think that's unfortunately the reality that a lot of young writers don't understand, is that who's going to sell your books? You are.
Well, now I guess the publisher one, if you're on, this is the other thing, shows my age, right? I mean, Twitter and tweeting and Instagram, whatever it is that you kids do on the internet. If you have a following, right? If you have a platform, and if you have, so many followers, I mean, that's all to the good, right? Because they theoretically bring those with you to the book world, which is not necessarily the case. But nonetheless, that's an expectation now. So that's yet again another kind of level at which you have to be playing at. That if you're a writer and so they want to do all that, then where does that leave you?
You can't just sit in your home office and write books. You got to do Zoom. You got to do whatever. You got to get out there and promote and let people know that your books are out there.
I think actually younger people are more equipped to do all those things because they've grown in an era where they've had to do it. I think it's newer writers who are maybe middle-aged, maybe you're a debut author, in your 40s or 50s. That's when
that's middle-aged, 50s. Yeah.
It's very hard to make that adjustment. I mean, there are people who get their first book published when they're older.
Absolutely.
And that's, I think, very difficult, right? That's very difficult.
Yeah.
Well, you do reference, I mean, your books are slightly different than.
Yes, of course. I'm not trying to sell, I'm very happy if I sell 40 copies, it's. No, but I mean, my friend, I was, let's see, I was 48 when my first book came out, I guess. And I didn't know anything about social media and all that sort of stuff. And I was 58.
No, is that true?
58, yep.
You stayed on top of social media relatively.
I try. I mean, I don't know. How many followers do you have, literally? Do you know, Naomi?
On what platform?
Twitter.
Oh, there you go.
Maybe 2,000.
Yeah. I have about 3,000, 3,500, And you see the writers like our friend Neil Gaiman, 4 million followers.
There you go.
That's not me.
That's it.
Well, I think we use these platforms to network. It's not, you're not going to sell more books. It's more like getting to know other writers. It's
exactly. And I've mentioned the Mystery Writers of America several times in this interview. And of course, that's where I met Gary as well. And, one of the great surprises to me was my very first MWA meeting. I remember going to lunch at some restaurant or hotel, sitting at a table, and everybody else was a published writer at the table. And I knew their names, but every single one of them had a day job. And that was like, oh my goodness. Yeah. I didn't understand that. But that was the reality then, and it's still very much the reality for many people. I don't know whether either of you, Naomi, are you writing full-time now, basically?
I am, but I'm juggling a lot of different projects. I do not.
Gary, I know you've been doing it for a while, so.
I was kind of fell into it. It wasn't quite the plan, but my last real gig, what was that? Be 2005 or 6, maybe, something like that. About 15, 16 years ago, I was the communication director for the Legal Aid Foundation. I think that was my last real gig. Yeah.
Paycheck, the last paycheck.
But even with that gig, right, I was still writing Yeah, I was still writing novels. You know?
So what I was going to say is that MWA, the SoCal chapter of MWA, which has about 350 members, I loved being involved with the organization. It was such a wonderful opportunity to meet other writers. And one of the great things that I found early on, and I know you have too, is the collegiality that I think it's Michael Connolly who said it first or somebody, but who said basically, look, if you succeed, that doesn't mean that I fail.
Yeah.
So the community all basically loves to support each other. If somebody buys your book, maybe they'll buy my book too.
Because mystery readers are rabid, you know, they and it's not like we're competing for that prestigious, you know, literary award. You know, I mean, we have awards in our community, but it's not the same as in the.
Yes, says the woman who, have you won the Edgar or just been nominated a couple
I've
times?
won
She's won it.
You won one and were nominated a second time, as I recall. And yeah, it's better than a poke in the eye.
There you go.